It's about what?
I'm sad for those who don't feel that they are loved in order to work in this life.
There are certain figures in American culture who feel less like celebrities and more like family. Fred Rogers was one of them. For generations of children who grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he wasn't simply a man on a television screen. He was the neighbor who showed up every single day, who spoke slowly and deliberately, who looked directly into the camera as though he could see straight through the glass and into the living room where a child sat cross-legged on the floor, needing exactly what he was offering. He was warmth made visible, patience given a cardigan and a pair of sneakers. But Fred Rogers was also a man, a husband, a father, a person who carried private weight behind the public gentleness. And it was only through the voice of the woman who knew him most completely, his wife of more than 50 years, Joan Rogers, that the world finally began to understand what life with Fred truly looked like when the cameras were off and the neighborhood went quiet. Before Joan passed away in January 2021 at the age of 92, she spent years carefully lifting the curtain on the private man behind the beloved icon. What she revealed wasn't scandalous. It wasn't designed to shock or to diminish. It was something far more profound than that. It was the truth, complicated, tender, and deeply human, and it has forever changed the way the world understands one of its most cherished figures. To truly appreciate what Joan shared, you first have to understand who she was. Joan Bird was born in 1928 in Jacksonville, Florida, and from her earliest years, she was someone who moved through the world with both grace and quiet strength. Music found her young, and she found it right back. By the time she was old enough for grade school, she was already demonstrating the kind of natural piano talent that made teachers stop and pay attention. She wasn't performing for applause. She was playing because the language of music said things that ordinary words simply couldn't reach. She went on to study at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, where she majored in music performance. It was there that her story first intersected with Fred Rogers. Both were music majors. Both were serious about their craft. Both had a quality of presence that made the people around them feel genuinely heard. What drew Joan to Fred wasn't his looks or his ambitions. It was the way he listened, truly, fully listened. In a world full of people waiting for their turn to speak, Fred Rogers actually heard what was being said to him, and Joan recognized that immediately as something rare. Their connection grew slowly and organically, built in practice rooms and music halls, shaped by shared values and a mutual understanding that ran deeper than romance. After college, Fred moved to New York to begin working with NBC, while Joan stayed in Florida. They sustained their relationship through letters, handwritten, carefully considered, carrying the kind of weight that only paper and ink can hold. When Fred eventually proposed by letter, Joan was so overwhelmed with emotion that she ran to the nearest phone booth to say yes before she could even fully catch her breath. They married in 1952 and began building a life together that would span more than half a century. They had 2 sons, James and John. They played piano duets in their home. They created something that most people spend their whole lives searching for, a partnership built on being fully known and fully accepted. The world that watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood believed it was seeing the real Fred. And in many ways, they were right. Fred Rogers genuinely practiced what he preached. His former colleagues and friends consistently described a man who was kind even when no one was watching, thoughtful even when he was tired, and present even when life was pulling at him from multiple directions. The show ran from 1968 to 2001 across 895 episodes, and at the heart of every single one of those episodes was a man who believed, without reservation, that every child deserved to feel valued. He created an emotional vocabulary for children at a time when no one else in television was doing anything remotely similar. While other programs chased bright colors and fast movement, Fred slowed everything down deliberately. He talked about divorce, about death, about fear, about anger, not in sanitized, comfortable ways, but honestly, in terms children could absorb and sit with. He didn't speak down to his young audience. He sat with them. Behind the scenes, Fred maintained routines that reflected the same intentionality he brought to the show. He swam every morning. He prayed regularly. He kept his weight at exactly 143 pounds, a number that held personal significance because one letter spells I, 4 letters spell love, and 3 letters spell you. That wasn't a quirky coincidence. That was Fred Rogers deliberately choosing to carry a message of love in his very body, every single day, for most of his adult life. But Joanne was the first to gently correct the narrative that Fred was some kind of effortless saint. She was clear about this, and she was consistent. Fred Rogers was a genuinely kind man, she said, but he was no saint. Kindness, in his life, was not a passive default. It was an active and daily choice. He worked at it. He chose it, sometimes against exhaustion, sometimes against frustration, sometimes against the quiet, but very real pressure of being someone that millions of people needed to be a certain way. That pressure was something Joanne understood intimately, because she lived alongside it. Fred poured himself into his work with a depth of emotional investment that was both his greatest strength and, at times, a considerable personal burden. He cared about getting it right because he understood the stakes. When you are speaking to children about how to handle the hardest feelings of being human, there is no room for carelessness. Every word on his show was chosen deliberately. Every moment was shaped with intention. And carrying that level of care for decades takes a toll that is invisible to the outside world, but very visible to the person sharing a home with you. Joanne has spoken about how she often took on the role of disciplinarian with their 2 sons, because Fred struggled with that aspect of parenting. His nature was to be the gentle presence, to comfort rather than correct, and while that made him a beloved figure to children everywhere, it meant that the harder work of setting boundaries at home often fell to Joanne. She handled it without resentment, but she handled it honestly. Their marriage, she made clear, was real, not idealized. It had seasons of imbalance, moments of strain, and the ordinary friction that comes from 2 strong people building a shared life across decades. What kept them grounded was not perfection. It was commitment. It was the kind of quiet, unshowy love that doesn't make headlines, but that quietly holds everything together. Fred, for all his public gentleness, needed Joanne in ways he rarely articulated publicly. She was his anchor. When the emotional weight of carrying a generation's worth of feelings became heavy, she was the steady ground beneath him. When self-doubt crept in, and it did more often than anyone outside their home ever knew, she was the one who held space for that doubt without letting it swallow him. The moment that changed everything came in the final chapter of Fred's life, and it is here that Joanne's decision to break her silence carries its deepest meaning. In late 2002, Fred Rogers began experiencing discomfort that was easy to dismiss. Indigestion, fatigue, the small complaints of a body that had been working hard for decades. He managed it quietly, the way he managed most things, with patience and private concern, not wanting to worry anyone. Joanne watched him try to work through the discomfort on his own, adjusting his diet, being careful, hoping the unease would pass. It didn't pass. When the pain became too persistent to explain away, they sought answers. The diagnosis, when it came, was stomach cancer. And the news was not good. The cancer had already spread, and the outlook the doctors offered was sobering. For a man who had spent his entire career helping other people sit with difficult truths, Fred Rogers was now being asked to sit with one of the most difficult truths a person can face. What Joanne witnessed in those months was a side of her husband that the world had never seen, and that she had never expected to see quite so completely. Fred was courageous. He remained determined to stay connected to the things and people he loved. In January 2003, just weeks before he died, he appeared as the Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade in Pasadena, a gesture that spoke volumes about his commitment to showing up, even when showing up required everything he had left to give. But alongside that courage was something more vulnerable. The certainty that had always characterized Fred's public presence, that steady, unshakable calm, gave way in private moments to fear and to something that resembled loneliness even when the people who loved him were all around. He was facing an ending, and no amount of gentle wisdom makes that easy. Joanne watched the man who had spent his life giving comfort, now needing it in ways he had never needed it before. She became his caregiver, the dynamic between them shifted in ways that were both tender and hard. She describes feeling an enormous weight of love during those days alongside the genuine strain of watching someone so vital and so alive confront the reality of leaving. There were moments when all she could do was be present, not solving, not reassuring, just there, holding the space, letting him feel what he felt without needing to package it for anyone else's comfort. Fred found peace in music during those final weeks. Even when his body was weak, even when getting out of bed was a challenge, he would make his way to the piano. The music gave him something that words, for once, could not. It was its own kind of coming home. He passed away quietly on February 27, 2003, at home, surrounded by his family. It was just one day after his grandson's birthday. He was 74 years old. For years after Fred's death, Joan kept many of these details private, partly out of respect for his memory and the image he had worked so carefully to build, partly because grief has its own timeline and doesn't announce when it's ready to be spoken aloud. But as time moved forward, Joan began to understand that keeping this part of the story hidden was actually a disservice, not only to the people who loved Fred, but to Fred himself. The world had constructed an idea of Fred Rogers that was almost mythological in its perfection. Endlessly patient, effortlessly good, never tired, never frightened, never in doubt. And while the kindness was absolutely genuine, the mythology was incomplete. By sharing the truth, the cancer, the vulnerability, the fear, the moments when the most comforting man in America needed to be comforted himself, Joan wasn't diminishing her husband. She was honoring him more fully than any myth ever could. She said in one interview that in his final days, she told him that they were going to be okay, that the boys would be fine, that she would try to be fine. And when he went, she could feel that he went at peace, even, she said, with a kind of joy. That image, Fred Rogers leaving this world the same way he entered every episode of his show, with gentleness and with love, is perhaps the most fitting ending imaginable for the life he lived. But Joan was equally honest about what came after for her. Grief, she said, does not follow a schedule. It does not respond to willpower or good intentions. Some days she felt energized. Some days she felt utterly depleted. The exhaustion of mourning someone you spent more than 5 decades loving is not the kind of thing that resolves in a predictable arc, and Joan refused to pretend otherwise. In doing so, she once again showed the world something true and valuable. The same thing Fred had spent his career showing children. Feelings are real. They deserve to be acknowledged. There is no shortcut through them. After Fred was gone, Joan did not retreat. She became the steward of his legacy with a quiet but unmistakable ferocity. She served as chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions, the company Fred had founded, ensuring that his creative mission continued to reach new generations. She gave interviews and appeared at public events, consistently and patiently reminding the world why the values Fred had championed, emotional honesty, kindness, the dignity of every individual, were not nostalgic relics, but living, necessary principles. She appeared in the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, in which Tom Hanks portrayed her husband. Her cameo was brief but resonant, a real presence in a story about the man she loved, adding a layer of authenticity that no amount of research or performance could fully replicate. She was also a visible presence surrounding the acclaimed 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, which introduced Fred Rogers to a new generation and reminded everyone else why he had mattered so deeply in the first place. Joan Rogers passed away on January 14, 2021, at the age of 92, at their home in Pittsburgh. She was surrounded by people who loved her. She is survived by her 2 sons and by a legacy that is every bit as meaningful as the one she spent nearly 2 decades protecting. What Joan Rogers ultimately gave the world, through her years of quiet guardianship, her willingness to speak hard truths, and her unwavering commitment to honoring the full humanity of the man she loved, was a gift that Fred himself would have deeply appreciated. She gave us permission to see him as he actually was. Not a saint, not a myth, not an untouchable icon dressed in a cardigan, but a man who chose kindness deliberately, who struggled privately, who feared the things we all fear, and who, even in his final days, found a way to leave the world more peacefully than most of us will ever manage. Fred Rogers once said that the greatest thing anyone can give is their honest self. Joan Rogers gave us exactly that, both about herself and about the man she shared her life with. And in doing so, she didn't change how we remember Mr. Rogers. She deepened it. She made it real. She made it human.